The words hit Belle Covington like a bucket of ice water thrown across her face on the coldest morning in December. He sold you along with the contract. She stood in the center of Joseph Slater's sprawling ranch house, dust still on her boots from the long ride out from Caldwell, Kansas, her brother Eli's letter crumpled in her fist. The paper trembled, or maybe that was her hand. She could not tell anymore. The late afternoon sun sliced through the single glass window and laid a bar of gold across the pine floor between her and the man who now, apparently, owned the arrangement that included her life. Joseph Slater was not what she had expected. He was tall in a way that filled a doorframe without arrogance, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair that needed a cut and eyes the color of a Kansas sky just before a storm, not quite gray, not quite blue, something restless and watchful living in between. He was maybe 30, 32 at the outside. He was also looking at her like she was the most inconvenient thing that had ever walked through his front door, and he clearly had no idea what to say. "Let me see the letter," he said finally. "You have seen your version of it." Belle did not release the paper. "You hired my brother Eli to work your cattle operation. You paid him 2 months' wages in advance. And somewhere in that arrangement, my brother decided that I would come here and keep your house." Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Inside, the word betrayal was burning a hole through her chest. "He wrote me that it was a housekeeping position, a real job, wages. He did not mention that he had already spent those wages on a gambling debt in Wichita before I ever boarded the stage." Joseph opened his mouth. "Do not," Belle said quietly, "tell me you knew nothing about it. Because if that is the truth, then you owe me an explanation for why your name is written at the bottom of that letter alongside my brother's, and why it says, plain as anything, that the arrangement suits both parties." The silence between them was the kind that had weight and edges. Outside, a horse shifted in the yard. Wind moved through dry grass. Somewhere beyond the barn, a cattle dog barked once and went quiet. Joseph Slater crossed his arms over his chest and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, like he was asking God for patience. Then he looked back at her. "I signed a work contract for your brother," he said. "I did not sign anything about you. Whatever Eli told you or wrote to you or arranged without telling either of us, that was Eli's doing." He paused. "But you are here now, and I can see you have nowhere else to go tonight, or you would not be standing in my house looking like you want to take my head off with that letter." Belle said nothing because he was correct, and she hated that he was correct. "So here is what I will do," Joseph said, uncrossing his arms, his voice careful and deliberate the way a man speaks when he is choosing each word like he is choosing footing on a bad trail. "I need a housekeeper. I genuinely do. The position exists whether Eli invented it or not. I will pay you fair wages the same as I pay the hands, prorated for the work. You will have your own room, your meals, and your privacy. And in the morning, if you want to take the stage back to wherever you came from, I will pay your fare." He met her eyes. "But if you stay on your own terms, not your brother's arrangement, yours." Belle looked at him for a long time. She thought about Caldwell, Kansas. She thought about the boarding house room she had given up, the $3 she had saved over 2 years of sewing other women's wedding dresses. She thought about Eli's face, that charming, reckless, dear, and infuriating face, and the way he had always believed that problems could be solved by simply creating new arrangements with other people's lives. She thought about the fact that she was 23 years old, that she was standing in Indian Territory on the edge of the Kishom Trail corridor in the year of our Lord 1878, and that she had exactly $4.30 in the bottom of her traveling bag. "I will stay," she said, "on my own terms, and you will make sure my brother understands that he does not get to make arrangements with my life again." Joseph nodded. There was something in his expression that she could not read yet, not quite relief, not quite respect, but something close to both. "Agreed," he said. That was how it began. The Slater Ranch sat on 4,000 acres of rolling grassland along a creek called Bitter Run, about 40 miles south of Caldwell, deep in what was still technically disputed territory in 1878. The federal government had been renegotiating land agreements with the various nations of the Indian Territory for years, and the cattle drives that came through on the Kishom Trail kept the whole region in a state of constant, low-level tension. Joseph had built his operation there 6 years prior, when the land was cheaper precisely because it was uncertain, and he had spent every one of those 6 years proving that the uncertainty was navigable if a man was honest in his dealings. He employed 5 permanent hands. He ran about 800 head of longhorn cattle. He had a main house, a bunkhouse, a proper barn, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, and a kitchen garden that had been allowed to go entirely to ruin in the 2 months since his last housekeeper, a widow named Mrs. Prout, had gone back east to live with her daughter. The house itself was a solid structure, 2 stories, limestone foundation, pine plank walls, a real iron stove in the kitchen that someone had hauled out from Wichita at considerable expense. It was not luxurious, but it was sturdy and serious, like the man who had built it. Belle assessed all of this within her first 24 hours, cataloging it the way she cataloged everything, with the quiet systematic intelligence that people who did not know her often mistook for shyness. She was not shy. She was observant. She had grown up in the practical poverty of a farming family outside of Caldwell, the second of 4 children, with a mother who died of a fever when Belle was 12 and a father who grieved himself into uselessness for the following 3 years before he found sobriety again, too late to save much of anything. She had learned early that the world did not reward waiting and hoping. It rewarded learning exactly what was in front of you and figuring out what to do with it. What was in front of her on the Slater ranch was a great deal of neglected work, a kitchen that needed a thorough cleaning, a vegetable garden that could still be salvaged if she started immediately, a man who was deeply private, not unkind, and clearly unaccustomed to having a woman in his house, and a brother somewhere on the property who owed her an explanation she was not yet ready to receive calmly. She found Eli on the second morning. He was repairing a fence line on the eastern pasture, and he looked up when he heard her coming and had the grace, at least, to look genuinely ashamed. Eli Covington was 26 years old, taller than Belle by nearly a foot, with the same dark honey hair and the same stubborn jaw, and eyes that were green where hers were brown. He was handsome in a way that had always been more trouble than help, because it made people inclined to forgive him before the situation warranted it. He was also, Belle knew, a man who genuinely meant well, who was genuinely sorry for the harm he caused, and who was genuinely incapable of thinking past the next 3 days when money was involved. "Belle," he started. "I am going to say this once," she said, standing on the other side of the fence. "You took a gambling debt and you solved it by trading my future to a stranger. You wrote me a letter with half the truth in it and let me sell my room and spend my savings on a stage ticket. I knew you needed to get out of Caldwell," Eli said. "I knew Mrs. Haverfield was going to close the boarding house and you would have nothing. I was trying to. You were trying to solve your problem," Belle said. "And you found a way to make it sound like you were solving mine at the same time. That is a thing you do, Eli. I love you, but I need you to know that I see it clearly." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Slater has given me a real position with real wages. I am staying because I choose to, not because of your arrangement. And if you gamble those advance wages away and he dismisses you, that is your consequence to live with. I will not intercede for you." Eli looked at the fence post. "I know," he said quietly. "I am sorry, Belle, I truly am." She believed him. She always did. That was the hidden cost of loving someone like Eli. The apologies were always genuine, and they were never enough. She walked back to the main house and started on the kitchen. In the weeks that followed, Belle established herself in the Slater household with the quiet efficiency of someone who has been working hard since childhood. She restored the kitchen garden, planting the last of the season's beans and squash, and keeping the remaining herbs from going entirely to seed. She deep-cleaned the main house from ceiling to floor, discovered that the water supply from the well needed a new rope and pulley, arranged for one of the hands named Cyrus to repair it, and began producing 3 regular meals a day that were substantially better than anything the ranch hands had been eating. The bunkhouse was outside her stated duties, but she quietly improved that situation too, bringing a barrel of lye soap and organizing a weekly laundry rotation that the men, after initial resistance, were grateful for. Joseph noticed all of it. She could tell because he noticed everything on his property, moving through it with the same alert, unhurried attention she had observed in him from the first afternoon. He never commented on the improvements directly, which initially annoyed her, until she realized that he showed his awareness in other ways. The new rope for the well pulley was in place before she had finished organizing the kitchen, which meant he had sent Cyrus before she got around to asking. When she found that the kitchen lacked an adequate supply of canning jars and mentioned it in passing at dinner, a full case appeared on the kitchen porch 3 days later, delivered from Caldwell without any drama or discussion. He was a man who solved problems quietly and then moved on. Belle found this unexpectedly appealing in a territory where men seemed to feel that every action required an announcement. They had dinner together every evening, just the two of them, because the hands ate at the bunkhouse and Eli ate there with them at Eli's own insistence, some combination of guilt and pride keeping him at a careful distance from the main house table. The dinners were quiet at first, punctuated by brief practical conversation about the ranch, the weather, the cattle drive schedule. Joseph asked her opinion about the kitchen garden's yield. She asked him about the fencing situation on the north pasture because she had noticed it from a distance and it looked precarious. He looked at her sideways when she said that. "Most people don't look at fencing from a distance and draw conclusions," he said. "Most people are not paying attention," Belle said. That got the first real smile from him. It changed his face entirely, opening it up, and she filed that information away somewhere she did not immediately examine. The story of the territory unfolded around them as September pressed toward October in 1878. The Kishom Trail drives were winding down for the season, with the last big herds pushing north toward Caldwell and then on to the Kansas railheads. The political situation with the land was complicated. The Osage Nation held rights to significant portions of the surrounding territory, and the relationship between the various ranchers in the area and the Osage people ranged from hostile to respectful, depending entirely on the individual involved. Joseph's relationship with his nearest Osage neighbors was the respectful kind, a fact that distinguished him from several other ranchers in the area, and that Belle noted with quiet approval. There was also the matter of a man named Harlan Druce. Harlan Druce operated a competing cattle operation about 15 miles west, and he had been attempting to expand his range in the direction of Slater land for the past 2 years. He was the kind of man whose name came up in conversation with a particular tone, not quite fear, not quite contempt, but the specific wariness that people reserve for someone who has never been caught doing anything technically illegal, but who leaves a trail of suspiciously convenient outcomes wherever he goes. Belle heard about Harlan Druce from Cyrus, who was the most talkative of the hands, and who seemed to have decided within the first week that Belle was someone worth talking to. She heard about him from the Caldwell merchant, who made the monthly supply run. She heard his name in Joseph's voice exactly once, spoken quietly at the end of an evening meal when he mentioned that Druce had sent a man to approach 2 of his hands about jumping their contracts and coming to work for Druce instead. "Did they go?" Belle asked. "No," Joseph said. He moved the remaining bread on his plate with his fork. "But the fact that he tried tells you something about where his thinking is." "What did you do?" He looked at her. "I went to see him. And I told him that I was aware of the approach, that my hands had their contracts, and that I would appreciate him conducting his business on his own side of things." He set down his fork. He smiled the whole time I was talking. Belle understood the significance of that, A man who smiled while you were drawing a clear boundary was a man who had already decided the boundary did not apply to him. "Be careful," she said. He looked at her again, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not name. "I intend to be," he said. It was mid-October when Eli came to find her in the kitchen garden on a Sunday afternoon, turning his hat in his hands in the way he had when he was working up to something he did not want to say. "I made a mistake," he said. Belle straightened up from the bean rows and looked at him. "Eli, you make mistakes the way other men breathe." "You will need to specify." He had the dignity not to argue with that. "Druce's man approached me last week," he said, "offered me double wages and a cash advance." The word trap formed itself clearly in Belle's mind. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I needed to think about it." He held up a hand before she could speak. I know, I was going to say no. I had already decided to say no. But the man knew about the gambling debt in Wichita, Belle. He knew exactly what I owe and to whom. And he made it clear that if I stayed on with Slater and said nothing about this conversation, the information about the debt would find its way to people who would make my life difficult. Belle set down her gardening tool. The autumn sun was bright and cool and entirely indifferent to the problem in front of her. "He threatened you. He made a business suggestion with attached consequences." "Yes." "And you told Joseph." Eli's silence was its own answer. Belle pressed her fingers briefly against her forehead. "You need to tell Joseph," she said, "today, right now. If I tell him, he will know I was approached and didn't say anything immediately. He will think I was considering it." "Were you?" Another silence. "Eli." "For about 45 seconds, he said wretchedly. "And then I felt sick about it and I have not slept properly since." He looked at her. "Will you come with me?" She considered telling him that this was his problem to handle on his own. She considered reminding him that she had already warned him she would not intercede. But there was something in his face beyond the usual regret, something genuinely frightened, and she had spent 23 years being unable to fully abandon Eli when he was frightened. "I will walk with you to find him," she said. "But you do the talking." They found Joseph in the barn checking a horse's shoe, crouched in the dimness with his sleeves rolled up and a rasp in his hand. He looked up when they came in, reading the situation from their faces with that rapid attention of his, and stood up. Eli told him everything. The approach, the offer, the threat about the gambling debt, the 45 seconds of consideration, all of it. He told it straight and without embellishment, which was the only real thing Belle could say in his favor at that moment, and when he finished there was a long silence in the barn. "Why didn't you come to me the moment it happened?" Joseph asked. His voice was quiet, but it had something underneath it that was not quiet at all. "I was ashamed," Eli said, "of the debt. Of the 45 seconds." Joseph looked at him for what felt like a long time. He looked at Belle, and she saw him working something out in that private interior way he had. Then he turned back to Eli. "The debt in Wichita," he said. "How much?" Eli told him. It was not a small number. Joseph nodded once. "I will advance you against wages to clear it," he said. "That removes the leverage, and the next time someone approaches you with an offer or a threat and it takes you more than 60 seconds to come find me, you and I are going to have a different conversation." He picked up the rasp again. "You can go." Eli went. Belle did not. Joseph crouched back down beside the horse and resumed his work, and she stood in the barn doorway for a moment, watching the angle of his shoulders in the afternoon light. "You did not have to do that," she said. "Clearing the debt takes Druce's hold on him. That is a practical decision. You could have dismissed him and avoided the complication entirely." He glanced up at her. "I could have," he said simply, and went back to the hoof. She walked back to the house with something warm and complicated turning over in her chest, something she had been deliberately not examining for the past several weeks. She examined it now, briefly, the way you might look at something bright, just long enough to acknowledge it before you look away. She was in danger of falling in love with Joseph Slater. That was the secret she had been keeping from herself. She put it away carefully and went back to her kitchen. The situation with Harlan Druce escalated in November. when 3 of Joseph's cattle were found dead along the fence line of the northern pasture. The fencing cut, and the animals run through, and then apparently shot when they would not move far enough to be claimed as Druce's strays. It was a provocation wrapped in plausible deniability, and Joseph went to the county sheriff in Caldwell to file a formal complaint. The sheriff, a man named Beaumont, was polite and thorough in the way of a man who is aware of exactly how little his thoroughness will accomplish. He took the statement. He said he would look into it. Joseph came back from Caldwell with the look of a man who had done the right official thing and harbored no illusions about the outcome. Belle had dinner ready when he got back. She had made beef stew with the last of the autumn carrots and fresh bread, and she put it on the table without comment about where he had been, letting the meal speak first. Joseph sat down, ate, and only spoke when he had taken the edge off whatever he was carrying. "Beaumont is not corrupt," he said at last. "Just limited." "Druce has more resources than you do in the immediate county," Belle said. It was not a question. For now, he broke off a piece of bread. "I have been patient because patience is the right strategy with a man like Druce. He wants a reaction that he can use. But there is a difference between patience and letting him read it as weakness. What are you thinking of doing?" He looked at her across the table, and there was something different in the look tonight, something more direct than his usual careful watchfulness, as if the day's frustrations had worn away one layer of his usual reserve. "I am thinking," he said, "that it would help considerably to have a formal legal record of this property's boundaries and my water rights along Bitter Run. There is a land surveyor out of Wichita who does legitimate surveys for the federal land office. If I have a proper survey on record, it becomes significantly harder for Druce to claim confusion about where his operation ends and mine begins." He paused. "It will cost money I was going to use for expanding the herd in spring." Belle considered this. "But it protects everything you already have." "Yes." "Then it is the right choice," she said. He ate in silence for a moment. "Then most people would have said, 'You are giving up growth to defend what you have. That is a loss.'" "Most people are thinking about it wrong," Belle said. "You cannot build on a foundation that is under dispute. You defend the foundation first, then you build." He was quiet for a moment that felt different from other silences, weighted with something that made the back of her neck warm. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he asked. "Growing up without enough of anything," she said honestly. "When resources are limited, you learn to think clearly about what matters most." He nodded slowly. He was looking at her in that particular way again, and Belle made herself pick up her bread and take a bite and look at the window instead, and the moment passed, but it left something behind in the air of the room that neither of them mentioned. The surveyor came out from Wichita 3 weeks later. His name was Aldridge, a precise, dried-out man of 50 with excellent instruments and absolutely no patience for anyone who was vague about property lines. He spent 4 days walking the perimeter of Slater land, and during those 4 days, 2 of Druce's riders appeared at the edges of the property and watched from a distance with deliberate visibility. Joseph watched them back. He did not confront them. He let Aldridge work. The survey was filed with the Federal Land Office in Wichita on a Tuesday in late November, and that evening Joseph came back to the house with the receipt of filing in his breast pocket and a quietness about him that was different from his usual reserve. It was the particular quiet of a man who has done something that needed to be done and feels the rightness of it settling into place. He told her at dinner. Belle felt something she recognized as pride on his behalf, which was its own kind of admission, and she kept it off her face and simply said, "Good." He smiled at that smile that changed his whole face, and said, "You say that the way other people say thank God." "It means the same thing," Belle said, and he laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh properly, and it did something genuinely alarming to her internal equilibrium. She thought about that laugh for approximately 3 days. December came in cold and fierce, the way December came to the Kansas border region, with a north wind that had nothing between it and the Arctic and no apologies for the fact. Belle kept the stove burning and the house warm, and there was something quietly domestic and deeply dangerous about the evenings, the two of them at the table or in the front room, her sewing or reading, him working on accounts or correspondence at his desk, the wind throwing itself against the limestone walls outside and the lamp burning amber between them. She had started to know him in the way you know someone only through sustained proximity, the particular set of his jaw when he was working out a difficult problem, the way he always checked the horses himself before bed no matter how tired he was, his complete inability to leave an unfinished task sitting without addressing it, the small stack of books on his desk that ranged from cattle management manuals to a surprisingly worn copy of David Copperfield. The way he drank his coffee in the morning standing at the kitchen window, watching the light come up over the eastern pasture, with an expression on his face that was the closest thing to prayer she had ever seen from a man who did not go to church. She knew he had come to this territory from Missouri, that he had a brother back east who he corresponded with occasionally, that his parents were dead. She knew he had built this ranch from nothing but work and stubbornness, and the dangerous optimism of a young man who had decided that the uncertain frontier was a better bet than certain poverty anywhere else. She knew that he was scrupulously fair to every person who worked for him, including Eli, who had given him more than adequate reason to be otherwise. What she did not know was what he thought about her beyond the practical terms of her presence. He had been nothing but appropriate and considerate and carefully respectful of the terms he had laid out on her first afternoon, her privacy, her own terms, the clear professional framework of employer and employee. He had not once looked at her in a way that could be called inappropriate or made her feel that her position was anything other than what he had promised. He was, in fact, so consistently correct in his behavior that there were moments when she was not certain whether his care was principled restraint or simple indifference. It was Cyrus who settled that question, inadvertently and with the total unawareness of a man who has no idea he is demolishing someone's careful self-deception. Belle was in the barn one morning in mid-December when Cyrus came in for a piece of harness equipment and did not immediately see her around the corner of the tack room. She heard him talking to another hand, a young man named Pete, and she was about to announce herself when she heard her own name and stopped. "Slater's been different since Miss Covington came," Pete was saying. "Different how?" Cyrus asked. "Easier," Pete said. "You notice how he doesn't grind his teeth at supper anymore? How he actually talks at the end of the day instead of just telling us what tomorrow's work is." A pause. "She feeds us better too," Cyrus said. "It is not about the food, Cyrus." A longer pause. "No," Cyrus said, his voice carrying the weight of a man acknowledging something that he knows is true and not his business to discuss. "I reckon it is not." Belle retreated from the tack room before they moved further in her direction, slipping back out of the barn with her heart doing something irregular and complicated. She stood in the cold December air for a moment, pressing her gloved hands together, aware that she had just learned something that changed the internal landscape of the past 3 months considerably. She was not wrong about what she felt, and she was apparently not alone in feeling it. And that was a more frightening situation than either of the two possibilities she had been managing before. She went back to the kitchen and made herself very busy for the rest of the day. It was the evening of Christmas Eve that everything came to a kind of unavoidable head, not because of any grand declaration, but because of a small and honest moment that neither of them apparently had the defenses left to deflect. She had cooked a proper Christmas Eve dinner, a luxury that took most of the day, and used the last of the salt pork along with potatoes and the dried apples she had been saving, and she had set the table with a certain amount of care that she refused to interrogate too closely. Joseph came in from the evening barn check with his coat dusted with the first light snow of the winter and stopped in the kitchen doorway, looking at the table and the lamp and the food and her, and she saw something move across his face that he did not manage to contain in time. "This looks like more than a housekeeper's table," he said. His voice was quiet. "It is Christmas Eve," Belle said. She set down the dish she was carrying. "Sit down, Joseph." It was the first time she had used his given name. They both heard it at the same moment, and the silence that followed was the loudest silence she had ever experienced. He sat down. She sat across from him. They served themselves with the careful movements of two people who are both being very deliberate about where their hands are. "I want to ask you something," Joseph said, after they had eaten in that charged quiet for a few minutes. He was looking at his plate. "And I want you to feel entirely free to tell me it is none of my concern. I am aware that you work for me, and that puts a particular kind of weight on the question. I want you to know I understand that." Belle set down her fork. "Ask," she said. He looked up at her. The lamplight was doing something very specific to the planes of his face, and she was aware of it in the way you are aware of something beautiful that might also be dangerous. "Are you content here?" he asked. "Not just housed and employed and safe, but content in yourself." It was not what she had expected him to ask. The unexpected sincerity of it did something to the lock she had put on the thing she had been not examining since October. "I am," she said honestly. "More than I have been in a long time. Possibly more than I expected to ever be." She paused. "Are you asking because you want to know or because you are working toward something else?" He was quiet for a moment. "Both," he said. She nodded slowly. "Then you should know," she said carefully, "that I am aware of what I feel. And I am also aware that you are my employer and that I came here in circumstances that were not entirely my own choice, and that both of those things make me cautious about trusting what I feel." She met his eyes directly. "I would not want you to think that my feelings, if they are what I think they are, have anything to do with the arrangement, or with gratitude, or with not having anywhere else to go." Joseph looked at her with an expression that was something between relief and something much warmer. "That is exactly what I have been afraid of," he said. "Not what you would feel, but what your reasons for feeling it might be." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "When Eli came to me with his situation and I found out you were coming, I want you to know that I was not part of that plan. I did not agree to it. I did not want a woman here under those circumstances." He paused. "And then you arrived and you told me straight what the situation was and you asked for your own terms, and I thought, there is someone who knows exactly who she is." He looked at her. "That is a rare thing, Belle." The way he said her name was different from every other time he had used it, which was not often, and the difference was the difference between formal address and something that belonged only to the moment. "It is Christmas Eve," she said again, softer this time. "It is," he said. He was almost smiling, that smile that still did something alarming to her composure. "And there is something I would like permission to say." "You already said it," Belle said. He looked at her. "You said it quite well," she said. "And I've heard it." After a moment he reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. Just that. Just warmth and steadiness and the slight roughness of a working man's hand. And she turned her hand over beneath his and they sat like that in the lamplight on Christmas Eve, with snow beginning to come down outside, and the whole difficult, complicated, unexpected path that had led them both to this table sitting between them like something that had been, despite everything, worth following. Eli knocked at the back door an hour later, looking bashful and frozen, and she let him in for Christmas Eve bread and dried apple cake, and the three of them sat in the kitchen together. The most domestically unlikely family arrangement in the entire Oklahoma territory. And Belle watched Joseph talk to her brother with a patient decency that Eli had done nothing to deserve, and felt something in the region of her heart settle into a place it had been looking for without knowing it. January in the territory was a trial of patience and endurance, and it came with new trouble in the form of Harlan Druce. With the land survey on record, and the Wichita debt cleared, removing his leverage over Eli Druce, apparently decided that patient provocation was not accomplishing his goals quickly enough. In the second week of January, 3 of Joseph's permanent hands found their pay envelopes short, a bookkeeping error that traced back, upon investigation, to a Druce man who had been placed as a temporary writer 2 months prior, and who had apparently been doing a thorough job of noting the vulnerabilities of Joseph's operation. He had left the ranch in November, and the short pay envelopes were the delayed consequence. Then Joseph received a letter, delivered formally through the county land office, indicating that Harlan Druce was contesting the eastern boundary of the Slater property, citing a conflicting survey that Druce claimed predated Joseph's own. The conflict was manufactured. Belle recognized that immediately when Joseph showed her the letter, because she had been present for Aldridge's survey, and she knew that Aldridge had been meticulous. And because the survey Druce cited was dated 6 years prior, before Joseph had built anything on the land, which meant it was either a forgery or a document that had been creatively reinterpreted. "He is trying to create a legal complication that will cost you time and money to resolve," she said. "Yes. And if he can make the legal costs high enough, he is betting that you will consider selling rather than fighting." "Yes," she looked at him, "but you will not." "No," he said simply. She thought for a moment. "You need someone who can go through the actual federal land office records in Wichita and establish the clear history of this property's filing, not another survey." "The original filing records," she looked at him steadily. "Do you have someone who can do that?" "I could go myself," he said, "but I cannot leave the ranch for the 10 days that would take, not in January." "Eli can manage the day-to-day with Cyrus," Belle said. "They are capable." She paused. "And I would come with you." He looked at her carefully. "That is a long ride to Wichita in January." "I am aware of that." Something moved in his expression. "You do not have to do this." "I know I do not have to," Belle said. "I would like to. I can read records as well as any clerk, and I am considerably more motivated than any clerk you would hire." She held his gaze. "Let me help you with this, Joseph. Not as your housekeeper, as someone who has a stake in this ranch not being taken by a man like Harlan Druce." The silence between them was different from earlier silences. It had something in it that was almost the answer to a question that had not yet been asked formally, but that both of them knew was moving toward them. "All right," he said. "We leave Thursday." The ride to Wichita was 3 days in the cold, with proper supplies and 2 of Cyrus's most reliable recommendations for overnight stops at established stage stations. The cold was genuine and merciless, but the company was the opposite of that. Freed from the particular social choreography of the ranch, the employer and employee framework, the careful daily distances, they found themselves talking in a way they had not managed in the more structured domesticity of the winter evenings. She learned about his years in Missouri, about the brother whose name was Daniel, about the particular combination of ambition and restlessness that had sent a 24-year-old man south into uncertain territory with a small stake and a large determination. He had been out here 6 years, and in 6 years he had built something real, and she could hear in his voice that the thing Druce was threatening was not just property, but the proof of 6 years of his own life's work. He learned about her years in Caldwell, about the boarding house and the wedding dresses, about the $3 saved, and the calculations of a woman who understood exactly the mathematics of her own limited options. About what it was like to be the responsible one in a family when responsibility was still expected to look like accommodation rather than ambition. About the fact that she had wanted, quietly and without much room to say it aloud, to want things for herself. "What did you want?" he asked. They were stopped at the second stage station, warming up over coffee in a lamplit room that smelled of wood smoke and old leather. Belle wrapped both hands around her cup. "Something that was mine," she said. "A place that belonged to me because I chose it, not because I had nowhere else to go." She paused. "I was not looking for the territory, and I was not looking for your ranch. But I will say this, I cannot quite imagine being anywhere else now." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her in the lamplight with an expression that she had come to know and that still did to her what it had always done. "I need to ask you something properly," he said. "Not on Christmas Eve over a lamp on a table, properly." Her heart did something that was not quite calm. "Not yet," he said. "I want to settle Druce first. I want what I am offering to be clean and certain, not in the middle of a contested property dispute." He held her gaze. "Can you wait a little longer?" Belle looked at him for a long moment and felt the entirety of the past 4 months living in the space between them. The anger of her arrival and his careful offer, the vegetable garden and the ledger books and the Christmas Eve table and his hand over hers in the lamplight, and all the small daily choices that had nothing to do with arrangement and everything to do with who they were when they were paying attention. "Yes," she said, "I can wait." Wichita in January was a working city rather than a frontier town, with the stockyards quiet in the winter and the downtown brick buildings sitting solid and purposeful against the cold sky. The Federal Land Office was on Main Street in a building that smelled of paper and ink and the particular bureaucratic seriousness of government records. Belle spent 2 full days in that records office, while Joseph handled legal consultations with an attorney named Graves who specialized in federal land law. She was systematic and thorough, and she treated the records clerks with the respect of someone who understood that cooperation from the people managing the paperwork was worth more than any amount of authoritative posturing. By the end of the second day, she had located the complete original filing history for the Slater property, identified 3 separate inconsistencies in the dating and witness signatures on Druce's claimed prior survey, and organized the evidence in a way that even a county judge with no patience for complexity could follow. She brought the documentation to Joseph's attorney that evening. Graves read through it with increasing concentration and then looked up at her over his reading glasses. "Miss Covington," he said, "did you do this yourself?" "I did. This is better organized than what half my clerks would have produced." He looked at Joseph. "Where has she been for the past 6 years?" "Kansas," Joseph said. He was looking at Belle with something in his eyes that she chose, in the presence of the attorney, to simply receive without responding to. The legal resolution of the boundary dispute took 3 more weeks after Wichita, with the documentation Belle had assembled providing the core of the argument. The county judge, a pragmatic man named Hartwell, reviewed the discrepancies in Druce's claimed survey, noted the evidence of signature irregularities, and dismissed the boundary contest with a brevity that suggested he had not been particularly impressed with Druce's case from the outset. Druce did not take it quietly. He sent a man to the ranch twice in the following week, ostensibly looking for a stray horse, and the second time Joseph was waiting at the gate and told the rider very calmly that the next time Druce's men came onto Slater property without a specific invitation, he would take it as trespass and respond accordingly. He was not loud about it. He did not threaten. He simply made it clear and certain in that particular way he had that the boundary was real and that he would defend it. The rider went back. Druce's men did not return. It was not entirely over. Men like Harlan Druce did not simply accept being outmaneuvered. But the formal legal threat was neutralized. The survey was unimpeachable, and Druce had exposed enough of his methods in the failed boundary challenge that the county sheriff now had specific, documented reason to watch him more closely. Belle cooked a proper celebratory dinner in early February when the judge's decision came through, and Eli and Cyrus and Pete and the other hands ate at the main house table for the first time, crowding the room cheerfully and leaving an amount of mud on the floor that kept her busy for an hour afterward, and she did not mind it at all. After they left, after the dishes were done and the table was clear, Joseph came into the kitchen where she was putting the last of the cups away, and the house was quiet around them. "Belle," he said. She turned from the shelf. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, hat in his hands, which was not how he normally stood in his own house, and she realized he was nervous, which was something she had never seen from him, and the novelty of it made her heart move in a way she had stopped trying to manage. "I told you I needed it to be clean and certain," he said. "It is clean and certain. The land is mine and no one is contesting it." He looked at her directly. "You know what I want to ask you. You have known since Christmas Eve." He turned the hat once in his hands. "But I want to ask it out loud because you deserve to be asked out loud, not just understood. After everything, the arrangement your brother made, the circumstances you arrived in, the terms I gave you to protect your own dignity, you deserve to choose this freely and openly." Belle set down the cup she was holding. "Belle Covington," he said, "will you marry me? Not because it is convenient, not because of any arrangement, not because you are here and I am here. Because I have found, over these past months, that I cannot imagine this place without you in it, and I do not want to. Because when you are thinking through a problem, I want to be in the room. Because the way you look at the world straight and clear and without complaint about what is hard is the thing I admire most about anyone I have ever met." He stopped. "And because I love you, which I should have led with probably." Belle felt the smile come before she could arrange her face. "Probably," she said. "Is that a yes?" "It is absolutely a yes," she said, "because I love you, which you knew." "I hoped," he said. "There is a difference." She crossed the kitchen and he met her halfway, and when he took her face in his hands and kissed her, it was the kind of kiss that had 3 months of careful distance in it and no ambiguity whatsoever about the outcome. They were married in April, which was the right month for it in that part of the world, when the grass was coming up green on the prairie and Bitter Run was running clear and high from the snowmelt, and the whole landscape had the particular quality of beginning again that April always carried in the territories. The ceremony was performed by a circuit preacher named Alderman who came through the area every 2 months and who was delighted to have a wedding rather than the usual combination of last rites and baptisms that constituted his standard repertoire. Eli stood up with Joseph as his witness. Cyrus and Pete and the other hands came scrubbed and awkward in their best clothes and stood in the yard outside the main house and looked genuinely happy, because ranch hands who eat well and are treated fairly by their employer have a particular affection for anything that perpetuates the conditions responsible for their comfort. Belle wore a dress she had made herself in the previous 3 weeks, practical enough for the frontier, made of pale blue wool that she had ordered from the Caldwell dry goods merchant along with a length of cream-colored ribbon. She had no illusions about it being a grand dress. It was an honest dress, made with her own hands for a life she had chosen with her eyes open, and she felt entirely right in it. Joseph, watching her come across the yard toward him in the April light, looked like a man seeing something he had not quite let himself believe was real until it was standing directly in front of him. Alderman conducted the ceremony with economy and a certain weather-beaten sincerity, and when it was done, Joseph kissed her to considerable noise from the assembled hands, and Eli, standing nearby, had the look of a man who had accidentally done something right for the first time in his life and was not entirely sure how it had happened. That evening, sitting on the front porch of what was now definitively her home in the last of the April light, Belle thought about the letter in her fist on the day she had arrived, the crumpled paper and the word betrayal, and the furious, frightened knowledge that she had been moved like a piece on a board without her consent. She thought about Joseph's offer, your own terms, and the 7 months between that offer and this evening, and all the things that had filled those months: work, conflict, discovery, the slow and genuine building of something that had not been arranged by anyone, that had simply grown in the space between 2 people paying close attention to each other. Eli came and sat on the porch step below her, and for a while they did not speak, which was unusual for Eli and a testament to the fact that the day had moved him somewhere past his usual ease with words. "I know I do not deserve credit," he said at last. "No," Belle agreed, "but I am glad you are here." She looked at the last of the sunset over the western pasture, the sky going red and gold above the dark line of the horizon. "So am I," she said, "more than you can know." Spring moved into summer, and summer into the rhythm of a first year of marriage that was, like all first years, a combination of the expected and the genuinely surprising. The expected: that they worked well together, that their complementary ways of thinking about problems produced better results than either of them alone, that the ranch ran more smoothly and more thoughtfully than it had before. The unexpected. How much she enjoyed the specific quiet of early mornings with him. How completely the distinction between her work and the ranch's work dissolved when they were the same household. How much room there was in a man who was by nature private and contained for a warmth that had simply needed the right context to come forward. He was not a man who spoke love easily or often, but he demonstrated it in the particular language of someone who pays sustained attention, noticing when she was tired before she said it, making sure the kitchen garden had adequate water when July turned brutal and hot, bringing her back a particular book from the Caldwell General Store that she had mentioned in passing 4 weeks earlier with no expectation that he had noted it. She learned to hear affection in the quiet, consistent texture of his presence, in the way he always told her where he was going and when he would be back, in the evenings when he would sit close enough that their shoulders touched and read without either of them needing to narrate the contentment of it. The cattle operation expanded as planned in the summer of 1879, with a new acquisition of 200 additional head that stretched the capacity of the existing range, but confirmed the financial solidity that the land survey had secured. Eli, still on the property and still working his contract with the steady application of a man who had learned something from his near disaster, turned out to have a genuine aptitude for the cutting and sorting work involved in managing a larger mixed herd, and Joseph began relying on him more heavily for that specific piece of the operation. Eli did not gamble anymore, or if he did, he kept it to the negligible stakes of a friendly card game with Pete on Saturday evenings, and the Wichita debt remained paid and did not acquire company. He was not transformed. He was still Eli, charming, occasionally late, inclined to solve problems at the last possible moment. But he was trying, in the particular way of someone who has been shown grace they know they did not earn, and is doing their best to deserve it in retrospect. Belle watched this without comment and felt something she identified as cautious optimism about her brother's future. In August, she confirmed what she had suspected for 3 weeks, and she told Joseph on a morning when they were walking the fence line of the eastern pasture, which she had come to think of as their fence line since she was the one who had found the evidence that defended it. He stopped walking. He turned and looked at her with an expression that was unlike any expression she had seen on him before, not quite his working look, not his affectionate look, not his storm sky thoughtful look. Something that had never been there before, something open and undone. "Are you certain?" he said. "As certain as one can be at this point," she said. He reached for her hand and held it for a long moment without speaking, looking out over the eastern pasture with the August light on his face. Then he looked at her. "Are you well?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "Strong," she said. "A little sick in the mornings, but strong." He nodded. He kept holding her hand. He said, "I have thought about children. I had not quite believed it would happen quickly. It has been 11 months. He turned that into a small smile. "Yes," he said. "I know how time works." She laughed, and he brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her fingers and looked at her over them with that look that still did the same thing to her it had always done. "I want to take good care of you," he said. "Both of you." "You already do," she said. The pregnancy was healthy, and the fall of 1879 passed in the ordinary, extraordinary way of waiting. Belle continued her work with the necessary modifications. She trained Eli's Saturday card game companion Pete in the kitchen garden work, so that there was reliable help as her energy shifted, and she spent the cooler fall evenings in the front room planning the expansion of the root cellar storage that would be necessary for the increased household demands of the following year. Joseph was attentive without being overprotective, which was what she had hoped from him and what she received. He took on more of the physical work himself and arranged without announcement for the specific things she would need, and in the evenings he was simply there, present and steady in the way that was his particular gift. Eli built a cradle. He did it over the course of 3 weekends in the bunkhouse with Pete's grudging assistance, and it was not beautiful in a professional sense, but it was solid and carefully sanded, and it sat in the corner of the bedroom waiting with a patience that matched the season. The baby arrived in late February of 1880, after a long labor that was attended by the territory's closest thing to a midwife, a capable Osage woman named Mary, whose English was limited but whose competence was absolute and whose presence Belle was deeply grateful for. Joseph stayed within calling distance the whole time, which the practice of the era suggested was unnecessary, and which Belle found she wanted anyway. The baby was a boy. They named him Thomas. He arrived in the world with considerable vocal opinion about his circumstances, and within approximately 48 hours had rearranged the entire gravitational center of the Slater ranch around his 7-pound, 8-ounce presence. Joseph held his son for the first time with the careful, deliberate wonder of a man handling something that seems improbably real, and Belle watched him from the bed where she was resting, watching the expression on his face that she had never seen on anyone before, and that she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. "Thomas," Joseph said quietly, to the small face in the crook of his arm, "welcome to Bitter Run." Eli appeared at the bedroom door the following morning with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who has just been rearranged by events beyond his expectation. He looked at his nephew for a long time, and then looked at Belle. "He looks like the both of you," Eli said. "That is a diplomatic outcome." "Eli," Belle said. "I know," he said. He cleared his throat. I wanted to say that I know I made a poor choice in how I brought you here. I know that. And I know that it worked out, but that is not to my credit. It is to yours and his." He nodded at Joseph in the corner. "I am grateful that you are both too decent to hold it against me permanently." Joseph looked up from the baby. "You have worked out well," he said, in his straightforward way. "That is the only accounting I need." Eli looked like he might be managing something difficult in the vicinity of his eyes, and covered it by announcing that he had better go check on the horses. He went. Belle looked at Joseph. "You know that is the kindest thing you could have said to him," she said. "I know," Joseph said. He looked down at Thomas again. "He is going to be a useful uncle." Spring returned to the territory in 1880 with the quality of a year that feels like a genuine beginning. Thomas grew with the unreasonable speed of all babies, demanding attention and producing it in equal measure. The ranch expanded further, with a new section of fencing and a second well dug in the northern pasture, and the land survey that Belle had assembled in Wichita continued to hold against any further challenges from Druce, who appeared to have found other ambitions after the failure of his boundary contest. The larger world was shifting too. The era of the great open-range cattle drives on the Kishom Trail was coming to its natural close as the Kansas railheads consolidated, and the barbed wire that settlers were stringing across the plains began to change the geography of the drovers' routes. The Slater Ranch was positioned well for this change. The land survey and the Bitter Run water rights were exactly the kind of fixed, legal foundation that would matter when the fluid era of open territory resolved into something more structured. Joseph had seen this coming. Belle, thinking it through alongside him in the evenings and in the long practical conversations that were the deepest form of their partnership, had helped him see it more clearly and plan for it more specifically. They made decisions together, not in the sense that she deferred to him while he consulted her, but in the genuine sense that they were two minds working on the same problem who came to conclusions that neither of them would have reached as cleanly alone. She discovered she was expecting again in the late summer of 1881, and the news arrived differently than the first time, with a kind of steady, settled joy that was the product of a life that had found its footing rather than the surprised wonder of the first announcement. "Another one," Joseph said when she told him. He was entirely still for a moment, and then he smiled. Not the small, careful smile, not even the big one that changed his face, but something new, something that went all the way through him. "Good," he said. The second child was a girl. She arrived in the following spring with considerably less drama than her brother had, and with a focused expression that both of them recognized as entirely familiar. They named her Clara, and she was from the beginning a small, self-contained personage who appeared to have arrived with most of her opinions already formed. Thomas, now 2 years old and in possession of strong preferences about the world, was initially uncertain about his sister, and then decided she was acceptable, which was about the best endorsement available from a 2-year-old and was received as such. Eli, by this time, had acquired his own situation. He had been courting a woman named Me who worked at the dry goods store in the nearest small settlement 10 miles east, a forthright and sensible woman of 25 who appeared to have no illusions about Eli's character and to find him worth the effort anyway, which Belle privately thought was either great wisdom or great courage, and possibly both. They were married in the fall of 1882 in a ceremony that was almost as well attended as Joseph and Belle's own, and Eli built a small house of his own on the eastern portion of the property, with Joseph's blessing, and moved out of the bunkhouse at last. The ranch in 1882 was a different entity from the uncertain, contested property Belle had arrived at 4 years prior. It was secure, established, and expanding in the deliberate way of something built on solid ground. Joseph had 1,700 head of cattle. He employed 8 permanent hands. The main house had been expanded with a proper second floor and 2 additional bedrooms, and the kitchen garden was no longer a survival measure, but a genuine kitchen garden with enough variety to make a Caldwell merchant envious. Belle stood on the porch on an October evening in the last light of the year's most beautiful season, watching Thomas run in wobbly, determined circles in the yard with the cattle dog, a young animal named Scout who had arrived as a puppy the previous spring and had immediately transferred his primary allegiance to Thomas. As all dogs in all eras do with the youngest available child, and held Clara against her shoulder with the specific ease of a woman who has learned the particular weight and warmth of her own child. Joseph came out to stand beside her, a cup of coffee in his hand, and they stood together in the particular companionship that belongs only to people who have been through something together and come out the other side of it into something they could not have predicted and would not trade. "I have been thinking," he said. "Always something to manage," she said mildly. He gave her the small, careful smile that she still loved most. "I want to register the property under both our names," he said, formally. It should have been done at the beginning, and it was not. He was watching Thomas and the dog with a slight frown that she recognized as the expression of a man organizing something he has thought about for a while. "This is your home as much as it is mine, more in some ways, since you defended it from a man who would have taken it." He glanced at her. "I should have offered that before now." Belle looked at him for a long moment. At this man she had been furious with before she knew him, at the face she had memorized over 4 years of mornings and evenings and disagreements, and cattle problems and legal battles and Christmas Eve tables and the specific lamplight of 1,000 ordinary nights. "Yes," she said, "you should have." He looked at her. "But you are not holding it against me." "I am holding Clara," she said. "I do not have a free hand for holding anything else." He laughed, that full, genuine laugh that she had heard the first time 4 years ago, and that still meant the same thing to her that it had then. That meant he was entirely present, entirely himself, entirely hers, and reached over and took the baby from her so that she had both hands free, and she put one of them on his back, and they stood like that in the October light with the boy and the dog running in the yard and the grassland going golden to the horizon. She thought about the letter, the crumpled paper, and the word betrayal. The forced choice that had turned out not to be a trap at all, or not only that, or rather, it had been a trap that she had walked through and out the other side of, and found something on the other side that no one had arranged for her, that no one could have arranged, that had simply grown between 2 people paying honest attention to each other over 4 years of real life in a real place. He had hired her brother and gotten her as part of the arrangement. He had never complained. She had arrived furious and frightened and determined, and she had stayed on her own terms, and those terms had become this house, this land, this man, these children, this October evening. There was a justice in it, she thought. Not the clean, simple justice of stories, but the messy, earned kind. The kind that comes when people choose well in spite of imperfect circumstances, when decency meets decency, and something grows from the encounter that neither party had quite expected. Thomas fell down in the yard and got up and kept running. Scout barked once in pure enthusiasm. Clara made a small, thoughtful sound against Joseph's shoulder and went asleep. "Come inside when you are ready," Joseph said quietly. "Supper is not going to make itself." "It has never made itself," Belle said. "That is entirely my doing, and I would appreciate the acknowledgement." He leaned down and pressed his mouth briefly and warmly to her temple, which was not quite an acknowledgement but was considerably better. "Noted," he said. The years after that settled into the good, ordinary texture of a life that was working as it was supposed to, not without difficulty, because the territory and the cattle business and the particular nature of two strong-minded people sharing a household and a vision guaranteed that there would always be something demanding problem-solving. But the difficulties were the productive kind, the kind that tested the foundation and found it solid rather than the kind that eroded it. In 1883, they lost 40 head in a flash flood on Bitter Run that came out of a 3-day September rain, and they rebuilt the northern herd over the following spring without panic and without recrimination, simply with the sustained practical attention of people who knew how to sustain attention. In 1884, a young woman named Rosa arrived in the territory with her small daughter, her husband having died of a fever on the trail west, and she came to the Slater ranch looking for work. Belle hired her immediately for the kitchen and the house, not because the work had become too much, she was capable of managing it, but because Rosa needed the position, and because the house was big enough, and because Belle had not forgotten what it was to arrive somewhere with little and be offered terms that were both fair and dignified. Rosa stayed. She became part of the household in the way that people do who are given genuine room to belong, and Thomas, who was 4, developed a serious affection for Rosa's daughter Nettie, who was 3 and possessed of an imperious sweetness that Thomas's more boisterous personality found entirely compelling. Eli's wife, Mee, had her first child in 1884, a son they named Henry, and the ranch property in its broader sense had become a community, the way frontier settlements did when the right people anchored them. In 1886, Belle's 3rd pregnancy arrived, confirmed in February on a cold morning that felt very much like the February morning 6 years before when she had told Joseph about Thomas, except that they were standing in the kitchen rather than on the fence line, and the kitchen had a lamp over the table and bread rising on the counter, and 2 children's voices coming from the upstairs bedroom, where Rosa was getting them up for the morning. She told him, and he looked at her with the look she knew best now, the one that was a combination of everything he was and everything they were, the one she thought she would be seeing for the rest of her life and was profoundly grateful for. "Good," he said, which was what he had said the second time. She suspected he would say it every time. "Good," she agreed. He pulled her close and held her there in the warm kitchen with the bread rising and the children's voices above them, and the January cold window showing the bare winter pasture, and the first light coming up over the eastern horizon. And she stood in the circle of his arms, and thought that this was the thing she had not known she was looking for when she had stepped off the stage in Indian Territory 4 years ago with $4.30 and a crumpled letter and the furious, frightened, stubborn determination to live on her own terms. This was it. This was what her own terms had built. The 3rd child was another boy. They named him William, after no one in particular, just because the name suited the serious small face that arrived in the world in September of 1886, with his eyes already open, and looking around at the situation with what Belle felt was a somewhat judgmental expression. Thomas was 6, and took his responsibilities as oldest sibling extremely seriously, which mostly manifested as narrating William's limitations to anyone who would listen. Clara, who was 4, ignored her new brother with aristocratic completeness until he was approximately 6 weeks old and could be reliably held, at which point she transferred her entire focus to him with an intensity that suggested she had been planning this from the start. Joseph, holding his third child, looked the same way he had looked with the first undone, open, real. Belle watched him from the bed and felt the simple, enormous weight of a life that had grown so far beyond what she had arrived expecting. The last piece resolved itself quietly in the spring of 1887. Harlan Druce, having apparently exhausted his local ambitions and run his operation into the ground through overextension and the kind of shortcuts that work only when no one is paying attention, and the territory, by 1887, had considerably more people paying attention, sold his land to a legitimate ranching concern out of Texas and left the area. The information came through the Caldwell County Land Office in a routine monthly report that Joseph read over breakfast and passed across the table to Belle without comment. She read it, set it down, and drank her coffee. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window the way it always did, laying that familiar bar of gold across the pine floor, and the sounds of the household were everywhere: Rose's voice, the children's overlapping sounds, Scout scratching at the back door to be let in, the distant movement of the hands beginning their day in the yard. Belle looked at her husband across the breakfast table, at the man she had looked at across this table 1,000 times, at the face that had become as familiar and necessary to her as the view from the kitchen window. She thought about the beginning. She thought about the first afternoon, the crumpled letter, the word betrayal, the furious certainty that she had been moved without her consent. She thought about his offer, your own terms, and the 23-year-old woman who had stood in the middle of this room with $4.30 and a choice to make. She had chosen. It had not been the choice that Eli had arranged. It had been her choice, made from the inside of a real situation with real information, and it had led here to this morning, to this table, to this man who was reading the county report and drinking his coffee and who would look up in a moment and find her watching him and who would, she knew, do exactly what he always did, which was hold her gaze for a long, steady moment with that dark blue storm sky look that had never lost its effect on her, and then give her the small, careful smile that meant, "I know, I see you, I am here." He looked up, she was right. She smiled back, and the morning continued around them, and the life they had built from the ruins of a badly made arrangement, from her anger and his decency, and their shared stubbornness, and 4 years of paying honest attention to each other, moved forward into all the ordinary days that were still ahead of them, solid and certain and entirely their own. Outside, the spring grass on the Kansas border was coming in green along Bitter Run, and the cattle were moving in the morning light, and the fence lines were straight and properly surveyed and holding, and the air smelled like mud and new growth and everything that came after winter, which was, as it had always been, everything worth having.